Thank you, Gillian, and it is good to be back. I was based in this building. I was based in Aberconway with a few people I recognise in the audience who are still here, I'm pleased to say. But it was the end of '98 that I actually left Cardiff University, so it's great to be back, and especially to launch this new series on futures, which I've been preoccupied with, well, I suppose all my career to some extent, because if you're a planner, you have to think forward, you have to look into the future, whether short-term, medium or long-term. But it's in the last 10 years or so that I've really developed more academic work, stroke practice engagement work on futures in relation to the things that perhaps we take for granted, everything around us when it concerns the built environment, planning and housing. It was also good to come back to Cardiff and check into my hotel an hour ago, and the first thing I heard was Shirley Bassey. And I thought, yeah, I'm back. Although people do say I'm Burley Chassis, but that's another story altogether. I'm going to try and talk for about 35, 40 minutes. It's going to be punchy. There's going to be a lot there. Gillian, if I'm rambling on too much, as I tend to do sometimes, get the Muppets hook out and whisk me away and just stop me, because I want to have time for questions and discussion with you all as well. I'm going to cover, if you like, issues to do with the need of why futures is important, the drivers that we need to take into account, which justifies looking at futures in a slightly different way, perhaps to more disciplinary focused activities. Going to move on to thinking about methods, because futures isn't just a concept, it's a methods approach as well. And then talk about my practical experience of working in a place in the city in Newcastle, where I was for 8 years before I rejoined UCL 5 years ago, and trying to turn the concepts and theories into a programmable action, stepping over this imaginary red line for the academic between the academy and theory and actually getting your hands dirty in trying to shape events. So that explains the grey hair to some extent, but also it's a rewarding effort. Spot me. So this was taken almost 35 years ago next week. And that's what was the size of the planning department as it then was when we were based in the Aberconway building. That's our results day for my BSc in Town Planning Studies. And you notice there are twice as many staff as there are students in those days. And in fact, I think we were a cohort of something like 25, very small number of students. And I suppose with a t-shirt like that, I had to be in the middle, nowhere else. But it brings back all sorts of memories, of course, as well, about the fun times that we had and started, if you like, part of this journey as well. Here are the critical proposition issues I want you to think about and we want to discuss in more detail. And that is change in perspectives, away from disciplinary perspectives of issues and problems into looking at the complex, deep-seated nature of structural problems as all places are experiencing in one degree or another, the externalities that are that citizens and business governments are facing, the tools that we currently have to address it, which might not be longer fit for purpose to do the sorts of challenges that we're facing, and then moving beyond this single silo issue, that in terms of policies, but in terms of disciplines in the universities as well, and whether we are in the right place to resolve some of these things. The three sets of challenges I've put down here are, how do we begin to address these major seismic, structural, complex problems in a way that makes a difference at a time when perhaps government is no longer trusted by some, or whether it has no financial means to be able to address them in the way perhaps that they would like to, assuming that they would. How can we unearth and harness the assets and skills and uniquenesses of places to suit a proactive future for places? Because all places have assets, even if they seem really problematic now. There are things that can be unearthed. And whose role is it to do that, the coordination, if you like? And then the third issue is, should the university itself play a more civic facilitation role in shaping the future of places? And the hidden question, sub-question of the third one is it the university as an institution Is it the university as senior management, or is it the individual academics? And those three things don't always align, even in the same university. So there's an issue here about how to do it, if you're going to do it at all. How can we plan the long-term future of cities together? So when you talk about futures, perhaps some people think about a Blade Runner-esque vision of the future, maybe dystopia as opposed to utopia. Others see something which is a bit more familiar, but perhaps some aspects of the future is changed in some ways. And of course, it depends about how far into the future that you're looking at. So is this Westminster in 5 years' time, in 50 years' time? And of course, what it's meant to do is certainly using a imagery-based proposition is to get you thinking about whether this is a desirable future for people or it's undesirable future, and in whose interest does it serve. So it could be that sort of utopia, dystopia, imaginary that is starting to infuse literature, but certainly in geography and planning now, or it could be something quite different. Of course, we also have imaginary futures which never come about. So you might have seen this before. This is actually the plans for Cardiff. A few decades ago, 5 or 6 decades ago, I think, Neil, was it about 70, 65, 70? And that perspective is what you would see if you stood at the corner of North Road, Kingsway and Queen Street. Obviously, you don't need to see the courts and the Civic Centre. You can just about see the clock tower, and you'd have a nice modernist building with subterranean dual carriageway going past the castle. An imaginary future as a desirable future at the time from modernist planners and architects, but you look at it now and you think, thank goodness we didn't get there. You look at others, such as the plan for the city centre, coupled with the proposition for a new road system right through the area, including bulldozing through Cathays and Roath, in order to accommodate the car, because that was the perspective at the time about the need to accommodate this growth in the number of cars being owned by people. They became accessible commodity. And you think about this now as being desirable, undesirable, but also causing certain degrees of intervention. And those interventions, of course, are not static, that over time you need other interventions to deal with the externalities of intervening in the first place. But it doesn't mean to say that you don't stop and not do anything in the first place. And even this looks rather familiar, but in a short space of time, you realize how difficult it is to think about the future when the world around you is changing perhaps in a short space of time. So remember the beloved bus station before we have the giant square that's there now, or some of the buildings around the bottom of St. Mary Street and Westgate Street, all of which have gone, some of which have now appeared, or even what's happened to the Hayes, up here, and how remarkably different it has been. And this, of course, is just 17 years ago. So the change and the pace of change in some places can be quite bewildering. Interestingly, a lot of what's happened around the St. David's Centre, 1 and 2, is exactly what was in the Cardiff Centre plan in 1970. But you look at it now and you think, no, that'll never happen. It's just happened in a longer period of time in a slightly different way than expected. 21st century urban trends. Why are urban futures important right now? Because we're used to certain disciplines, and certainly my own disciplines of geography, planning, political studies, and film studies. We're used to thinking about those particular disciplinary perspectives of dealing with urban or place-based issues, or even rural futures, it has to say. But why is it important? Well, you have lots of things going on, and maybe there's a frustration with the degree to which we are unable to intervene, or in some cases and in some states, frustrated because politicians aren't willing to intervene, or frustrated because there's no money in the public sector or government to do the sort of intervention that's required, and a belief that maybe the public are disenfranchised in some ways, and some communities are disenfranchised by not having a voice in shaping their own futures, when clearly perhaps they have agendas and ideas that they would like to impose or enact in some ways. And a frustration with the political system generally about not being heard, about not being prevalent in some of the key decisions, whatever you think about them, to suit the future of places. And above all, perhaps a lack of, not necessarily imagination, but a sense of proactivity and progressiveness, that a lot of the negativity, a lot of the pessimism that we are used to on a daily basis now, thanks to media reports, but also social media misinformation sometimes, that there has to be an alternative, more progressive way of addressing some of these problems, and the system isn't perhaps doing that in the way that we expect it to. We also know that on a global scale, there are lots of things going on, and I don't want to depress you too early, but nevertheless, there are lots of things which are deep, deep problems that perhaps individual places can't rectify themselves, that some decisions are made in other parts of the world which cause ripple or domino or butterfly effects that cause some places to go up and some to go down. In the sense that, what can we do if national governments, and certainly populist governments, aren't willing to intervene on the sorts of things that need intervening? What can perhaps happen at a more local level or a regional level to counter some of those things and maybe seek alternatives as well? I won't go into the detail. We know the United Nations are interested in this with the SDGs, asking the governments to consider these things. And the problem is, when you relate these to perhaps the governmental process and the policy process, where these become policy silos. So individual nations and cities might tick the box of individual issues. But of course, that's not how people experience places. Thank God the world isn't structured A, like policy, and B, like universities. Because the interest is the interaction of how these things come together or not in some places. That creates opportunities, it also creates problems. So the spaces in between can be an interesting angle to look at if you're trying to carve out something progressive for the future as well. Where does the university come in? Well, you know, we're used to, certain disciplines, we're used to the university trying to make a contribution. It's trying to achieve impact in the parlance of today, but nevertheless, it's something that perhaps we are committed to individually. Maybe the institutions are committed to it, but nevertheless, if you're based in a particular place and the university is anchored in a certain place, it has perhaps a long history of intervention in its own backyard in some way, and trying to engage the academics in the interaction that you have in an individual place. You and I know that we have individual networks and relationships with all sorts of outside organizations, most of it perhaps unaware of the senior management who have their own more strategic relations, but nevertheless, those relationships are there. And we can harness the two sets of skills coming from the university and knowledges with the places that we are in. So it's not just about the internationalization agenda or global significance and reputation. It's about actually how can we address the problems that we are seeing around us as we come into work on a daily basis. There you go. The critical thing that my old boss in Newcastle used to say to us is senior management are used to this question about what the universities are good for. That's the wrong question. It's actually what we're good at. It's more interesting to ask about what are we good for? What's the soul of the university? What's the soul and passion of individual academics to get into this space and do something? And that was a question, even for a vice-chancellor, he used to ask the senior academics and his own professional service directors as well. There has to be something more than league tables. I won't go into that in any more detail at this point. So it's a very pertinent question to talk about from a futures point of view, these range of issues. The new approaches and new methods can come down to this. Now, I'll give you the game away now. I wrote a book a few years ago with Tim Dixon, and we tried to, if you like, carve out the agenda here conceptually and methodologically about what we had in mind. So the complexity, the cross-cutting nature of structural problems, the need to integrate or align different policy agendas, different structural issues, the change in narratives that not single disciplines can answer or resolve some of these tensions with places. It needs a fluidity within the university where you harness knowledge, skills, and methods from a range of different subject areas into one whole and see how they relate to each other. It's about adopting city foresight, which is an established scientific concept and set of methods, but perhaps have been neglected, certainly in planning, for a long period of time, and you still need city visions as well. And there is a role for urban planning governance and for local democracy. This is not about usurping any of those things. It's just trying to put in a more progressive, proactive agenda because it's been absent for so long. There isn't a view that city visions are a waste of time, that they're impossible because of the complexity that we see, but actually I think you need a game plan. You need some sort of pathway, a destination of hope perhaps, or where places can work towards as of that sense of vision. It doesn't mean to say it's a blueprint. It is not the overarching agenda of one single political leader, but nevertheless you have a track that you're committed to getting out of your current situation and improving life for the majority. And it's not also just a prediction of looking into the crystal ball about how places might be in the future. It's about co-production, co-creation, about introducing more participatory methods in having conversations in your place about how to realize these things and knowing what to avoid as much as what to do. Now, in that book, we make the argument of developing this concept, so a brief few minutes covering this. Urban futures, we have a definition. It's to imagine what cities, urban areas, equally it could be rural areas, will be like in the long term, how they'll operate, what infrastructure and governance systems will underpin and coordinate them, how they are best shaped and influenced by their primary stakeholders, civil society and governments and businesses and the academy. And it should be analytical, investigative, diagnostic, participatory, exploring the future through city foresight techniques, city vision in collaboration, innovation. Bit of a mouthful. You could never remember that in the pub later, I know that. But nevertheless, many of that makes sense. Much of that should make sense. But for some reason, that's not the set of principles that we've anchored into our current planning system. And it's not something that perhaps has been written on the heart of people who are responsible for managing change in places anyway. And maybe we need to think about this. So that's, if you like, the agenda. And what does that mean? Well, it's about considering complex problems and how they can be addressed simultaneously rather than silo by silo, policy by policy, seeing about that interactivity. It's about medium to long-term futures because that has gone, certainly gone from planning. It's now short-termism, it's election cycles, it's non-committed action, and it lacks embeddedness into addressing long-term issues. There are exceptions, of course, but nevertheless, that long-term focus of what we're here to do tends to have been written out of where we are today. But you can still address the here and now. You can still address short-term issues through a range of innovation projects. Policy takes longer to change, 5 to 10 years minimum to see any influence of policy. So in the meantime, focus on projects which are here and now, visible and meaningful for people, and they can get passionate about something they want to be involved with. Moving away from trend-based plans, adopting an array of methods, and rely on the unique character of place. Achieving sustainable, inclusive, and smart places. That sounds very academic. It's actually taken from Planning Policy Wales. So even the officials perhaps had some sense of what the ambition was, even if it hasn't been translated yet in through the plan system, notwithstanding the Future Generations Act and its relationship to planning, of course, there. So we move from planning to urban futures, and it could be achieved by adopting these 4 things. So this is where, if you like, I couldn't resist moving from the theory and the concepts into doing something a bit practical. I'm not one of these social scientists who think I can't step over the line and just observe and analyze and critique. I want to get my hands dirty. So essentially, it's about developing city visions, that optimism, sense of hope, using participatory processes alongside representative democracy, multiple styles of democracy and involvement, using foresight methods on the future to think about long-term change, and hopefully then bring about place-based innovation in some ways. And with that in mind and the theory, we try to develop that into a series of methods and then actual pilots and case studies in practice with partners when I was based at Newcastle and set up Newcastle City Futures. Visualization on the city visioning, very important. Some of the most successful cities around the world have city visions. You might have seen them, Canberra 2050, There's a Bristol one, I think, isn't there, Peter? There's a Reading one. There's Melbourne 2045. There's Durban 2050 and so on. Long term. Now, some of these are not planning strategies. They're just visionary documents about this pathway and destination for the future. But they have a long-term aspect to them in all cases. And if you like, they do produce some incredible results for one reason or another. I'm not saying it's the only way that you bring about instrumental change, but nevertheless, it's important to corral lots of different agencies and actors into thinking about the future of your own place. That's city visioning. And an important aspect of the futures methods of city visioning is you have to backcast, not forecast, backcast. So you need to know how on earth did we arrive where we are today in a place and what critical decisions were made in the medium or long-term past to get here. So this is examples from Newcastle 50 years ago. And in some cases you think, oh dear, you know. Certainly the public's view is, oh dear, about what sort of interventions we made. But there are very good interventions about why, and justifiable grounds about why they were made at the time they were made. And the issue is not to skirt around the embarrassment of different trends and different attitudes and different styles, but trying to explain why we got here and the path that we got here before we even think about where we're going next. So you've got to confront, if you like, that history of past intervention and how it shaped the city in perhaps unforeseen ways. That's city visioning, and that's the backcasting element story that goes with it. And that could relate to all sorts of exercises of a methodological nature and a participatory nature. So we developed a whole series of conversations with the public and communities, especially youth groups and children, they are the future, right? In the Northeast about imaginaries, about imagining where the city is going, what sort of city is desirable. It could be used in all sorts of creative methods. Now, we didn't necessarily have that as planners and geographers themselves, so I had to lean on those of a more creative bent in the university to be part of this conversation. They had skill sets in the university that we didn't have. So it wasn't a question of saying suddenly the planner can do this alone. It was about developing internal partnerships across a range of skill sets and knowledges as well, and developing digital tools, not just drawing and artistic tools as well. Then there was the participation, and for this we adopted open innovation. So we were interested in the four sectors: government, industry, business, academia, and the community. And if you know Karayanis's work of open innovation, which has been developed over the last 15 years or so, there's a triple helix, a quadruple helix, and now is a quintuple helix as well. Environment has been added in. But this is the quadruple helix. And the idea is, can we get these four sectors working together or even speaking together in the city without one sector saying, I'm in opposition to you and therefore I'm not going to work with you. And that's to try and get over this polarization sometimes that you find in places of mistrust, of uncertainty, or people taking the goods at the expense of others. So it was trying to move the goalposts in that conversation. And I'm reminded, of course, that Jane Jacobs wrote this in 1961, saying, no single element in the city is in truth the kingpin or the key. The mixture itself is kingpin, and its mutual support is the order. Now, that requires in itself an interesting balancing act, juggling act, to try and harness the four sectors and not dominate at the expense of others. But you begin to see and begin to realize that perhaps there are voices in these sectors who currently don't have a voice in their place, but who have ideas about how to shape that issue. So we use open innovation, and we placed Newcastle City Futures not just in the academy bubble, but actually in the middle of the Venn diagram. And I tell you, although I thought that might be a comfortable place to reside, it is also one of the most uncomfortable places to reside, because you're constantly facing different people's agendas and trying to reconcile them when they're polar opposites. But we had to employ lots of different methods in order to get those conversations going. So this is one of the Lego mashups that we devised, this new workshop that we devised to try and get individuals from different sectors and organizations speaking to each other for the first time. So you might have a chief exec of a multinational sitting next to a director of planning from the council, sitting next to a school teacher, sitting next to a mental health worker, sitting next to a resident from a community interested in green in their city. And they were deliberately mixed up on the round tables, and we gave them challenges to think about one negative issue in the city, one positive issue in the city, and try and work on reconciling it. Not expecting that they would come up with a solution, but the whole point is them talking to each other and understanding and listening to each other in order to start an interesting, more proactive dialogue. And these were so successful, we had a waiting list to get on these, about 45 people each session. We ran 8 of them in total. And what happened at the end of it is that people said, this was so fantastic, 2 or 3 hours work. People built their ideas in Lego at the end, and they all became 7-year-old again. But they were so enthused by it is that they didn't just then want to talk about the problem and the solution, they wanted to actively do something. And that was a bit unexpected. We were just hoping that they would listen to each other and start a dialogue. No, they got over that very quickly. And then they wanted to do something, which put us in an interesting perspective as the academic about whether you facilitate that as well. That's really stepping over the red line into becoming an advocate and so on. Interesting ethical dilemmas associated with that as well. Then you have the foresight methods, and this is where we set up the platform. We were fortunate enough to get UKRI funding, European funding at the time, as thankfully it's back again, as well as Government Office for Science, who were doing a project on the future of cities at the time. Small amounts of money, I think in total over a 5 or 6 year period, we had something like 300,000 in total. And that was the basis of employing 2 members of staff. My time was initially 1 day a week, but eventually it became 4 days a week. So my department was more than happy for me to get out so that they would have a temporary replacement lectureship coming in their way. But it was about engagement, research, and collaboration, and really not knowing where we might end up with it as well. The aims was to take an overarching look, so very much the principles that we adopted in the theory of urban futures, think about it methodologically as well, get people focused on the long term beyond their silo mentality and their own agency perspective, think about the role of the university and what it wants to do in that, but also a place-based future vision. But critically, this was the sequence of events. So it was, for those of you familiar with REF and the idea of winning a research project, undertaking the analysis, disseminating and achieving impact, this was the reverse. This was the exact reverse. So we started with engagement using those creative methods. Then we looked at the research of the place that was already going on in the university, not new research. Then we thought about ways this could be incubated, where the different sectors and academics as well could be brought together, and then think about the acceleration of developing innovation. Now, at that point, we didn't think we would do this, because that's not our responsibility. Some would say democratically we had no remit to do any of this as it was, but that didn't stop us at the time. The issue was that everyone else, if it was successful, would get the credit. If it didn't work, I'd get the blame. That's the contract, if you like, I had both in the university with senior management, but also with other sectors as well. I'm going to zip through this very quickly. Newcastle itself has a major set of structural problems which are unlike other places, and some of this might be familiar in different degrees. So it has a low economic activity rate compared to the UK. It has an aging society, which causes its own problem. It has a terrible life expectancy, including in some places 61 in Byker, for example, compared to the UK average. It has terrible GCSE educational attainment. It has 35% of children in poverty. In fact, that figure is now 48%, would you believe? It has an alternative housing market where own occupation is 69% compared to the UK average of 81, and almost half the people in the city don't have a car. And those are just a handful of the headlines of what's going on in that place. A lot of these are not technically planning, but it doesn't matter because you're dealing with the place as it is and you're looking at the prospect of how it could be in the future. What I realized very quickly, as well as trying to engage people beyond the university in a whole host of sectors and get them speaking and listening to each other, I had to do exactly the same job inside the university. So in order to meet the agendas and passion and ideas outside, you had to do alignment, but the alignment also occurred inside across different schools and departments and faculties as well. And the easy way of doing that was to list all the blue chip funding that had come into all other departments and say, can we have part of that, please? And by part of it, I'm saying just 3 figures, 4 figures. That's all I want. In return, we're going to give you some really great ideas to do some participatory work. We'll give you free ideas. You can have complete intellectual property ownership of what's going on, but we need your support inside the university to make this happen. So here all the blue are all the projects that were going on at the same time as we were doing, and essentially I made all the leads of those projects co-eyes on my project. So essentially like there was double dipping going on, so that they would develop their own projects that would suit them, but equally would suit our platform as well. And so we were harnessing, if you like, a total of something like £40 million in research money from other parts of the university to do the alignment and to encourage them to basically undertake research and case study work in their own backyard, because we've identified that there was a need to do it. We then developed Delphi methods, another part of futures studies, which looks at the interrelationship, degree of interrelationship between different aspects and different sectors. Delphi methods really underused, fantastic, to work out the strength of interrelationships between different sectors as well. And that meant that we could somehow prioritize or address, if you like, what perhaps were the priority issues for the people that we were considering. We then summarized all that research work going on in the city as well, and in some cases it was very difficult to work out what's going on in your own institution, sometimes in your own department. So I spent a long time going through press releases of all things, because there was no communal intelligence base to work out who was doing what in your own city and your own university. We then created a foresight methods report. Of that, we consulted on it, 5,000 people got involved with that, invited to submit ideas. We adopted other foresight methods, including scenarios, which are very important long-term scenarios about the future, optimistically, but perhaps pessimistically, about what might change. We had Brexit in there 5 years, 6 years before it actually happened, and the domino effect it might occur into different parts of the region, economically as well as socially. And of course, it wasn't intended to be a plan, a vision or strategy, all-encompassing for the future. It was a summary of the issues and the choices that were available. The City Council didn't like us doing this because they were doing their own plan at the time. They were bidding for devolution, they were bidding for City Deal, and so they took their logo off the cover because it was there in the original draft and said, we didn't ask you to do this, why are you doing it? And we haven't come up with the ideas. You should ask the elected members what they think. He said, that's exactly why we are doing it. But after a few years of this being in existence, the officers started to use it, because it was a useful summary of some of the bigger trends going on in the city. That was the foresight report. We then created these sorts of infographics to communicate change, but also positive indices of the place, not just the negatives. So everything from every £1 that's invested in the city, there's a £4.50 return. Interesting dynamic. 3.6 million people visit the 10 largest cultural venues in the city. There are 80,000 students in the city. There's £1 billion spent in retail in the city on an annual basis. It was all pre-COVID, I should say. So, if you like, it was actually this, although it's important to look at the negatives and all the problematic issues, there's a lot going on that actually you could capitalize on. And so these were the assets, changing the conversation about actually this stuff that actually is quite good that's going on in the city, but we don't often talk about it or we don't see it. So this was important about creating a base language without using academic isms, without using legalese and policy speak on government or the plan system. It was creating visuals as a means of communication to all sorts of audiences and agencies. And then we created, if you like, these themes: age-friendly city, sustainable city, creative city, and science city. But interestingly, it's the interrelationships within each of them that's very important, because that's where you find the positive possibilities of unlocking something for the first time. Placemaking will require smart, multidimensional, and innovative thinking. Planning policy Wales again. So it's there. It's already there, just not acted upon. What we then move on to was this conversation about we're not just interested in the ideas, we're interested in doing something. So very quickly, in the final 18 months we were working, we facilitated and helped those sorts of mix of agencies across the quadruple helix to realize their own projects. We had no money of our own to do any of this. We were just shaping the pathway for them and seeing if a good idea is a good idea, it will get support. So, digitally enabled sustainable housing for the life course, especially for the eldest communities in Newcastle, suddenly became an interesting market housing option, which wasn't there before. That was developed into a mini exercise to the point where that project had 66 units given planning permission on a city centre location within 3 years of the initial project idea coming about. Remarkable, that urban innovation aspect that we didn't expect would ever reach that stage, but nevertheless that was the passion that was unfurled in one way. None of this was my project. It wasn't me, it wasn't my team. We were just, if you like, enabling people to speak to each other and try and find the ways of doing it. A new fleet of metro trains for Tyne and Wear Metro, but one which was accessible and inclusive and actually bespoke to the needs of the people of the Northeast. A digital project as well that involved 30,000 people being involved in that consultation exercise on behalf of Nexus and Tyne Wear Metro. That fed into the procurement for the new trains. So the new trains as they're being rolled out at the moment have everything in them that the public wanted from that consultation exercise. Development of the retail sector, a £50 million city plan on the back of it, dented during COVID, but it's come back again, including green in the city. And we were involved, and our academics were involved in each one. What I tried to do by saying to my academic colleagues in different departments is, here's a ref impact case study if you want it. Well, we've done the groundwork, we've developed the partnerships, you can take this forward. It's a research project in the waiting, you can take it forward. So each project had an academic anchor that might be based in lots of different departments as a way of unlocking it. I'll go through this quickly. Last mile projects to deal with congestion and air pollution issues, dealing with the public sector, reducing the number of vehicles off the road. We had, what else? New Gateshead Riverside Park, get people active in the city by regenerating part of Newcastle that needed regenerating, but thinking about the sports walking aspects of it as well. That was given a 10 million AHRC project. A new kind of void football in Newcastle. So this was the football club wanting to take over a redundant community building for local kids, and part of the city was deprived. We pushed them and said, if you want the money to do this, I think we can introduce you to people, but it's got to be something more than just kicking a football around. So how about if NEET's a problem in the city and people's skill sets and young people need to do something and be active, how about that they play football and then they code their results? So they learn digital and data skills while they're playing football. So it doesn't look like school, but nevertheless, that's exactly what's happening, but getting fun. That was opened by the mayor about 3 years ago with £12 million as well. And then all sorts of things about social housing and creating digital services where they own the platform. You can see the range of big guns that started to get involved with these projects. Now, none of these are based in the city, but they started to hover because they realized that they wanted to pick up the innovation. And we said, if you're going to come into this, A, you have to work with local partners. You're not taking the goods and running. And also, you're sharing the intellectual property. And if you can stand that, you can be part of it. Now, the city council people said, oh, for God's sake, you can't talk to IBM like that, because they won't come. They'll go to another city. I said, yeah, but we've got the ideas. So of course they'll stay. And all the business community actually played ball in those sorts of rules that we created for them. What we were trying to do in each case, as we started to do this very quickly, I realized time is going on, was to try and develop the projects to deliver 4 things simultaneously that sometimes don't fit together very well. So we wanted a project that would be an excellent research project. It would be perhaps a great business idea. It would be maybe a public sector cost saving, because city going through austerity at the time, we needed to address this. But it doesn't have to be a saving, but we had to factor that in. And a great project is also where the community partly designed it themselves. So we were trying to think that maybe these 4 things, if you got all those ingredients in a single project, you're going to unlock something distinctive, thinking that we'd be lucky to get 1. We got 80, and all of them fitted that agenda. So that's, if you like, the remarkable balancing act that we were all trying to do at the same times. Against all of that, we still had to write, and we still had to publish and produce the papers. So if you want to do look into this in more detail, whether that's the individual methods, all of which are open source, open access, then just search Newcastle City Futures in Google Scholar. Both consultancy reports and media reports, the books on digital and urban futures, as well as more academic papers dealing with different aspects of what we were trying to do, make it up as we go along. Also, I realized that in the process, we had to develop all sorts of methods to do it. Now, these are not methods which are unique to urban futures, perhaps, but nevertheless, we harness them and utilize them, and in some cases ask academic colleagues across the university to lead on them because we didn't have the expertise themselves. But it was about the creativity, the diagnostics, and the collaboration. But engagement, digitization, and visualization were 3 common aspects across everything we were trying to do. So the methods are transferable. We were looking at teaching opportunities. I was still teaching my modules at the same time, so we won several doctoral training centres for something like 60 PhD studentships. We won the ESRC Policy Fellowship on the back of it. We had internships going on in some of the projects given to other departments, not our own. Foresight workshops, hackathons, a pipeline of real-world projects that the university and the schools could take on for students in degree programs, extracurricular events, developing skill sets, and linking opportunities which were interdisciplinary. So these were, if you like, byproducts of what we were going to do, because the university was still expecting us to deliver the basics, not just this extra stuff. They were a bit suspicious, senior management, of the extra stuff, but they wanted us to deliver core teaching and business aspects. In total, 200 organizations engaged over 6 years, 36 million levered in for the partners in the city and region, not me, but we doubled that in terms of the research income coming in on the back of it. So unorthodox, perhaps it was, but nevertheless it delivered the goods for the university. And they were more interested in that number than the city number. 155,000 members of the public engaged, 80 projects, 15 ref impact case studies to be, change in governance processes. And when we were wound down, because we were so successful, we were abolished in 2019, but it was only meant as a temporary trial once we had the funding. What happened was the City Council created its own Directorate of City Futures to take forward some of those projects, which are still happening, but also perhaps to adopt the city of the methodological implications as well. I'll finish on this slide. I've taken up a lot of your time. And it is my 13 key points about how to do this or whether or not to do it. So partly in answer to some of the provocations I set and challenges, it's also about things that perhaps the university can consider, or even outside organizations. Is this something you or your university want to or able to do? Can you do it? Don't step lightly into this if you haven't got any commitment of carrying it forward. And you certainly need the, not the skill sets, you need, if you like, the time and effort that goes into nurturing and developing that trust. Start with open engagement. Don't adopt the university model of disseminating and telling the world, as I'm doing now, how it should be. This is about listening. So the first 2 years of what we were doing, I listened. I went round, listened to everyone about their perspectives of the future. That develops trust. Because otherwise people are saying, why on earth is the university doing this? Third one, use creative design, digital means to generate communication on others' terms, not your own suite of methods that you're used to, sometimes stepping into the uncomfortable zone and learning academically as you go along. Develop institutional process to endorse the outcomes of shared engagement. Don't do engagement if you don't know what to do with the outcome. If it works, it's fantastic. But if you then say, sorry, that was it, we were only interested in you talking to each other, that's not going to carry much mustard. Leave your high and mighty baggage at the door, develop a spirit of mutuality. In other words, I'm the dumb one here, so, I'm not going to say, just because I'm a professor, this is how the world is or should be. It's actually about listening and understanding why things don't happen in the way people expect it to. Adopt a suite of styles and methods to open up rather than close down ideas. Everyone's voice is legitimate, and you can adopt all sorts of methods to ensure that's the case. What's unique and distinctive about the place, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So there's always something distinctive, and there's always a prospect of something positive, but you need to uncover it and work on it. Don't do it all yourself. Rely on others who already have the experience of networking, community involvement, even government procurement processes, and they can be brought in and utilized. Focus on ideas that are visible and meaningful. They're the low-hanging fruit, the early wins. Don't be concerned about producing a plan, strategy, or policy. This is a cycle of activity. There might be a plan coming out of it, there might be a strategy, there might be a new policy, but that's not your intention. It's a continual process and a dialogue. Resolve issues to do with regulation, legal, procurement, political buy-in as results happen. There's a lot of that, and it requires a lot of behind-the-scenes work to smooth the path sometimes. But nevertheless, there are ways to ensure that is smoothed out. Expect successes and failures. Some of the projects I put up didn't happen. And we can learn from that experience. It doesn't say we don't do it ever again. We learn about why they didn't happen. And I didn't have any KPIs, by the way. So in that case, I could try all sorts of innovative things and fail and be the fall guy to some extent as well. But have an optimistic faith about doing. Share and celebrate outcomes and deliveries as joint efforts. This will feed back into the place innovation cycle, encourage others to get involved. And that applies inside the academy as much as outside the academy as well. So I've taken up a huge amount of your time. I've covered a lot of things, and I've talked non-stop, as I expected me to, notwithstanding the technical difficulties. So thank you very much for listening. Diolch yn fawr.